Thinking, Fast and Slow, Introduction Summary. Thinking, Fast and Slow, by Daniel Kahneman is a groundbreaking exploration of how the human mind works, focusing on two systems of thinking that drive decision-making. Kahneman, a Nobel laureate in economic sciences, delves deep into the cognitive processes that guide our everyday judgments and decisions, often in ways we don't realize. He introduces two modes of thought, System 1, which is fast, intuitive, and emotional, and System 2, which is slower, more deliberate, and logical. The book explains how these systems interact, how they sometimes lead us to make errors, and how understanding them can help us make better decisions. Kahneman discusses various cognitive biases, heuristics, and patterns that affect our thinking, from overconfidence to risk aversion. With over 2 million copies sold, Thinking, Fast and Slow has become a vital resource for understanding human behavior, decision-making, and the psychology of judgment. This summary will provide a detailed look at each part of the book, chapter by chapter, breaking down the essential lessons Kahneman offers and the key insights that can help readers make more informed decisions and avoid cognitive pitfalls. Part 1, Two Systems. Chapter 1, The Characters of the Story. Kahneman introduces two distinct modes of thinking, System 1 and System 2. System 1 operates automatically and quickly with little or no effort, while System 2 allocates attention to effortful mental activities, including complex computations. These two systems serve as the foundational framework for understanding human thought processes. Example: System 1 is activated when you effortlessly understand a simple sentence, while System 2 is called upon when you multiply 17 by 24. Action for Chapter 1. Become more aware of when you are using System 1 or System 2 thinking. Understand that many errors result from over-reliance on System 1. Key takeaway: System 1 is fast and intuitive, but it is prone to biases. System 2 is slower and more rational, but requires conscious effort. Chapter 2, Attention and Effort. This chapter explores the cognitive effort required by System 2. Kahneman discusses how tasks that require more focus and attention deplete mental energy, leading to decision fatigue, which can cause us to rely on easier, automatic processes, System 1. Action for Chapter 2. Conserve mental energy for important decisions by recognizing when you are mentally fatigued and when you might need a break. Key takeaway: System 2 consumes significant mental resources. Decision-making suffers when we are mentally drained, leading to reliance on System 1. Chapter 3, The Lazy Controller. System 2 is often reluctant to engage, especially when it feels effort is not necessary. Kahneman explains that our brain prefers to rely on System 1 unless forced to use the effortful System 2. Action for Chapter 3. Force yourself to double-check decisions that come too easily or quickly, as they may be driven by System 1's shortcuts. Key takeaway: the brain is lazy and tends to avoid effortful thinking, leading to reliance on System 1 even when it's inappropriate. Chapter 4, The Associative Machine. System 1 operates based on associations, linking ideas together in networks of thought. This chapter explores how our minds create associations that drive our immediate responses and judgments. Example: seeing the word bread might make you more likely to think of butter. These associations happen automatically. Action for Chapter 4. Be conscious of the associations your mind makes and question whether they are leading you to accurate conclusions. Key takeaway: System 1 operates through associations, which can sometimes lead us to inaccurate or biased conclusions. Chapter 5, Cognitive Ease. Kahneman introduces the idea of cognitive ease, explaining that when tasks are easy, our brain feels more comfortable, which influences our level of trust and confidence in decisions. Action for Chapter 5. Question decisions made under cognitive ease and be more skeptical when everything feels too simple. Key takeaway: cognitive ease makes us more likely to accept information as true without scrutiny, potentially leading to errors in judgment. Chapter 6: Norms, Surprises, and Causes. This chapter explores how our brains process new information by comparing it to existing norms. System 1 is responsible for detecting surprising events and attributing causes to them. Action for Chapter 6. Be mindful of how your brain assigns causes to events and whether this process might be driven by faulty assumptions or biases. Key takeaway. Our brains are wired to expect certain norms and detect surprises, but this process can sometimes lead to faulty conclusions. Chapter 7: A Machine for Jumping to Conclusions. Kahneman explains how System 1 jumps to conclusions based on limited information, which often leads to errors. It creates coherence by ignoring information that contradicts its initial assumptions. Action for Chapter 7. Challenge your initial assumptions and gather more information before jumping to conclusions. Key takeaway. System 1 often jumps to conclusions with insufficient information, leading to cognitive biases and mistakes. Chapter 8: How Judgments Happen. This chapter explores the mechanics of how judgments are made, often based on simple mental shortcuts, heuristics, that allow us to make quick decisions but also introduce bias. Action for Chapter 8. Recognize when you're using a heuristic and assess whether it may be leading you to a biased judgment. Key takeaway. Heuristics help us make quick decisions but can introduce significant biases. Chapter 9: Answering an Easier Question. System 1 often substitutes difficult questions with easier ones, leading to quick but potentially flawed decisions. Instead of answering complex problems, the brain answers simpler, related questions. Action for Chapter 9. Ensure you are answering the right question, not just the easiest one that comes to mind. Key takeaway. System 1 tends to substitute complex questions with easier ones, potentially leading to wrong decisions. Part 2: Heuristics and Biases. Chapter 10: The Law of Small Numbers. Kahneman explains the fallacy of small sample sizes and how people often draw erroneous conclusions from insufficient data. Action for Chapter 10. Avoid drawing conclusions based on small samples, as they often lead to incorrect assumptions. Key takeaway. The law of small numbers causes us to overestimate the significance of small samples, leading to biased judgments. Chapter 11: Anchors. This chapter explores the anchoring effect, where an initial piece of information, the anchor, influences subsequent judgments and decisions. Action for Chapter 11. Be aware of anchors and avoid letting them unduly influence your decisions. Key takeaway. Anchoring can significantly affect decisions, as people rely too heavily on the first piece of information presented. Chapter 12: The Science of Availability. Kahneman discusses the availability heuristic, where we judge the likelihood of events based on how easily examples come to mind, which can lead to skewed perceptions of reality. Action for Chapter 12. Be cautious of how easily accessible information influences your decisions, and seek more comprehensive data. Key takeaway. The availability heuristic leads us to overestimate the frequency of events based on how easily we recall them. Chapter 13: Availability, Emotion, and Risk. This chapter links the availability heuristic to emotional responses, explaining how emotions can distort our perceptions of risk and probability. Action for Chapter 13. Separate emotional reactions from risk assessments to make more rational decisions. Key takeaway. Emotions heavily influence how we perceive risks, often leading to inaccurate judgments. Chapter 14: Tom W.'s Specialty. Kahneman demonstrates how people often ignore base rate information, general facts, in favor of anecdotal or specific information, leading to biased judgments. Action for Chapter 14. Take base rate information into account before making any specific judgments. Key takeaway. Ignoring base rate statistics can lead to faulty predictions and decisions. Chapter 15: Linda, Less is More. This chapter explains the conjunction fallacy, where people assume that specific conditions are more probable than general ones. Action for Chapter 15. Question assumptions that seem overly specific and evaluate whether they align with basic probability. Key takeaway. People often mistakenly believe that specific details make a situation more likely, even when probability dictates otherwise. Chapter 16. Causes trump statistics. Kahneman argues that people tend to favor stories and causes over statistical facts, often leading to incorrect conclusions. Action for Chapter 16. Prioritize statistical data over anecdotal evidence when making decisions. Key takeaway. Narratives often overshadow statistical reasoning, leading to biased decisions. Chapter 17. Regression to the mean. Kahneman explains the concept of regression to the mean, where extreme outcomes are followed by more moderate ones. People often misinterpret this natural phenomenon. Action for Chapter 17. Be mindful of regression to the mean and avoid overreacting to extreme outcomes. Key takeaway. Extreme performances or outcomes are often followed by more average ones, a concept known as regression to the mean. Chapter 18. Taming intuitive predictions. Kahneman explains how intuitive predictions, often based on limited data, can be wildly inaccurate. He suggests adjusting these predictions based on statistical realities. Action for Chapter 18. Calibrate intuitive predictions by considering base rates and statistical norms. Key takeaway. Intuitive predictions are often inaccurate and should be tempered by statistical analysis. Part 3. Overconfidence. Chapter 19. The illusion of understanding. This chapter discusses how people often believe they understand complex events when, in reality, they are misled by their cognitive biases and hindsight. Action for Chapter 19. Recognize the limits of your understanding and be cautious about overconfidence in your interpretations. Key takeaway. The illusion of understanding makes people believe they comprehend events more fully than they actually do, especially in hindsight. Chapter 20. The illusion of validity. Kahneman discusses how confidence in one's judgments can be deceptive. Even experts can suffer from overconfidence, mistaking confidence for accuracy. Action for Chapter 20. Challenge your assumptions, even when you feel confident, and seek external validation or data to confirm your beliefs. Key takeaway. Confidence is not a reliable indicator of accuracy. Even experts are prone to the illusion of validity. Chapter 21. Intuitions versus formulas. This chapter compares intuitive decision-making with algorithmic or formulaic methods, showing that formulas often outperform human intuition, even in expert domains. Action for Chapter 21. When possible, rely on formulas or objective measures for decision-making, especially in complex scenarios. Key takeaway. Formulas and algorithms tend to outperform intuition in decision-making, even in areas of expertise. Chapter 22. Expert intuition. When can we trust it? Kahneman explores when expert intuition is reliable and when it is flawed. He identifies environments where intuition is trustworthy, typically in situations that are stable and predictable. Action for Chapter 22. Trust intuition only in environments where regular feedback allows for learning, and outcomes are predictable. Key takeaway. Expert intuition is reliable in stable, predictable environments with immediate feedback but less so in more variable or complex scenarios. Chapter 23. The outside view. This chapter explores the inside versus outside view, where individuals focus too much on their specific situation, inside view, and neglect general statistical information, outside view. Action for Chapter 23. Take the outside view by considering base rates and general statistics when making predictions or judgments. Key takeaway. The outside view, which considers general statistical trends, often leads to better predictions than the inside view, which focuses on individual cases. Chapter 24. the engine of capitalism. Kahneman explains how optimism, risk-taking, and overconfidence drive innovation and entrepreneurship. However, these traits also lead to failures and miscalculations. Action for Chapter 24. Balance optimism with a realistic assessment of risks, especially in business or investment decisions. Key takeaway. While optimism and risk-taking are essential for economic growth, they also lead to overconfidence and failure. Part 4, Choices. Chapter 25, Bernoulli's Errors. This chapter critiques the traditional economic theory of expected utility, proposed by Daniel Bernoulli, highlighting its limitations in explaining real human behavior regarding risk and reward. Action for Chapter 25. Recognize that real-life decisions often deviate from classical economic predictions, influenced by psychological factors. Key takeaway. Classical economic theories often fail to account for the complexities of human decision-making, particularly when it comes to risk and reward. Chapter 26, Prospect Theory. Kahneman introduces prospect theory, which describes how people value gains and losses differently, leading to irrational decision-making. Action for Chapter 26. Be mindful of how prospect theory affects your decisions, particularly in situations involving risk. Key takeaway. People are more sensitive to losses than gains, a concept central to understanding risk aversion. Chapter 27, The Endowment Effect. This chapter explains how people overvalue things they already own, a phenomenon known as the endowment effect, which can lead to irrational decision-making. Action for Chapter 27. Be aware of the endowment effect when making decisions about selling or giving up possessions. Key takeaway. The endowment effect causes people to overvalue what they own, making them less willing to part with possessions. Chapter 28, Bad Events. Kahneman discusses how people react more strongly to negative events than positive ones, a phenomenon tied to loss aversion and the negativity bias. Action for Chapter 28. Recognize your tendency to overreact to negative events and try to balance this bias by considering the bigger picture. Key takeaway. People are disproportionately affected by negative events, often leading to biased and irrational decisions. Chapter 29, The Fourfold Pattern. This chapter explores how people respond differently to risk based on the probability and size of potential outcomes, creating a fourfold pattern of risk attitudes. Action for Chapter 29. Understand how the fourfold pattern affects your risk-taking behavior in different situations. Key takeaway. The fourfold pattern explains why people sometimes take risks and sometimes avoid them, depending on the likelihood and magnitude of potential outcomes. Chapter 30, Rare Events. Kahneman explains how people tend to overweight rare events, leading to skewed perceptions of risk and irrational behavior. Action for Chapter 30. Be cautious of overestimating the likelihood and impact of rare events, and make decisions based on realistic probabilities. Key takeaway. People tend to overemphasize rare events, leading to irrational decisions and risk aversion. Chapter 31, Risk Policies. This chapter advocates for developing risk policies that help guide decision-making over time, reducing the influence of individual cognitive biases. Action for Chapter 31. Create personal or organizational risk policies that guide your decisions and help you avoid reacting impulsively to short-term circumstances. Key takeaway. Consistent risk policies can help mitigate the effects of cognitive biases in decision-making. Chapter 32, Keeping Score. Kahneman discusses how people often keep score in ways that lead to irrational behavior, such as by comparing themselves to others or holding on to sunk costs. Action for Chapter 32. Avoid the trap of keeping score in ways that are not productive or relevant to your long-term goals. Key takeaway. People often keep track of their achievements in ways that hinder rational decision-making. Chapter 33, Reversals. This chapter explores how people's preferences and choices can be inconsistent, depending on how options are framed. Action for Chapter 33. Be aware of how framing influences your decisions, and strive for consistency in your choices. Key takeaway. Framing effects can lead to preference reversals, where different presentations of the same information lead to different decisions. Chapter 34, Frames and Reality. Kahneman explores how the way problems are framed can affect decision-making, even when the underlying reality remains the same. Action for Chapter 34. Consider alternative ways to frame decisions, especially when evaluating risks and rewards. Key takeaway. The framing of a problem can significantly influence the decisions we make, often distorting reality. Part 5, Two Selves. Chapter 35, Two Selves. Kahneman introduces the concept of the experiencing self and the remembering self, explaining how these two selves perceive happiness and satisfaction differently. Action for Chapter 35. Recognize when your decisions are driven by the remembering self, past experiences, versus the experiencing self, current feelings. Key takeaway. The experiencing self lives in the moment, while the remembering self evaluates past experiences, often leading to discrepancies in how we perceive happiness. Chapter 36, Life as a Story. Kahneman explores how people perceive their lives as narratives, with beginnings, middles, and ends, and how this narrative approach influences memory and decision-making. Action for Chapter 36. Focus on the importance of how experiences end, as this can heavily influence your overall perception of events. Key takeaway. We remember experiences as stories, and the ending of these stories plays a crucial role in how we evaluate them. Chapter 37, Experienced Well-Being. Kahneman discusses how people measure their happiness and well-being in real time, often finding that life satisfaction and moment-to-moment happiness are not always aligned. Action for Chapter 37. Differentiate between moment-to-moment happiness and overall life satisfaction in your personal assessments of well-being. Key takeaway. Moment-to-moment happiness and life satisfaction are distinct, and we should be mindful of which we are prioritizing in our decision-making. Chapter 38, Thinking About Life. In the final chapter, Kahneman reflects on how people think about their lives and how their perceptions and memories shape their overall happiness. Action for Chapter 38. Be mindful of how your memories and perceptions influence your overall sense of happiness and well-being. Key takeaway. The way we think about our lives, and the memories we create, plays a significant role in determining our long-term happiness. Conclusion, Fast and Slow. Thinking, Fast and Slow, by Daniel Kahneman is a profound exploration of how human thinking operates through two distinct systems, one fast and intuitive, the other slow and deliberate. By understanding the biases, heuristics, and patterns that drive decision-making, Kahneman offers valuable insights into how we can improve our judgments and make better choices. The book emphasizes the importance of self-awareness, careful thinking, and understanding cognitive limitations to avoid common pitfalls in decision-making. The key takeaway from the book is that while our fast, intuitive thinking, System 1, is useful for many tasks, it is often prone to errors. Slower, more deliberate thinking, System 2, can help us make better decisions in complex or high-stakes situations. By recognizing the strengths and weaknesses of both systems, we can become more effective thinkers and decision-makers, avoiding common biases and improving our overall decision-making process. End of the book summary. Thank you. Book briefs, simplifying insights, saving your time.